So this is the presentation for results and that we have had for this work. In 2018, I worked with a task force on behalf of the NeIC, the Nordic E-Infrastructure Collaboration, and created a report which was basically a meta study using re3 data of repositories in the Nordic countries. And that meta study, that report includes some results that were based exclusively on the information that you will find, or at that time that was registered in the registry of repositories, re3data.org. And these are some of the slides from that report, based on a little over 60 repositories that were identified as belonging to the Nordic Baltic region. So this already showed in 2018 that not unexpected, a lot of repositories are not using PIDs extensively. So about 2/3 of the repositories in that sample were not using PIDs. Even less were using metadata standards, which is the right panel. The lower left panel shows that a bit more repositories were using licenses, and typically the Creative Commons one, but still a majority of them were not using any license at all, at least not declaring that. And finally, the very large fraction of repositories that were evaluated, or not evaluated, but included in this meta study sample, were also not certified. So about 16 or maybe 20 repositories were certified. Okay, so that led to basically these results were used as a sort of a background for when we wrote the FAIR part of the proposal for this Infra EOSC 5B call in the autumn of 2018. And this is now part of the EOSC-Nordic FAIR work package activities. So I work at Nordforsk, or the NeIC, the Nordic Infrastructure Collaboration, and I'm acting as the work package for the FAIR work package lead. So the team is consists of not 21, but I believe 19 participants now, scattered across the countries indicated here. So we are all involved in this work package 4, which is about which focuses on the FAIR aspects of research data. One important premise, we believe, in sort of spreading the knowledge and also, well, spreading to have a successful implementation of FAIR is to conduct extensive training and to so that people really understand what this is all about. And although that is not explicitly part of the EOSC-Nordic project, NeIC has initiated last year a number of training courses which are held by GoFair for NeIC, and in sponsored and also in collaboration with various Nordic collaborations, typically the Nordic coordinators, the national coordinators in the Nordic countries. So the next course is scheduled for 5th to 9th of October. It's a full week course, so it's quite extensive, but it gives a very, very thorough introduction to fair data stewardship. And this is the same course we have conducted first in Norway, then in Denmark last year, and now I had to move this from March, April to October due to the Corona situation. And hopefully we will be able to conduct it as planned. Otherwise, it may be executed as an online event. Anyway, that was also the registration link there for those that haven't yet registered for that, if interested. And that will basically by the end of this year, we hope to have more than 130 data stewards in the Nordic Baltic region, and that is one important aspect of for successful implementation of this of FAIR in the region. So what the project actually focuses then is on engaging the communities, and this event today is one major and very vital piece of that activity, along with the evaluation process, which I will talk about here. Then we will move on, and we will touch on this at the end in the next steps session at the very end of the day, regarding supporting communities in implementations. Since we have limited amount of resources, this has to be done in a smart way, and most likely that will be in collaboration with GoFair again, conducting hackathons or metadata for machine events. And then we will hopefully see implementations of and an increased fairness in the Nordic region among these repositories that we have now evaluated at an early stage in the project. So throughout this project, the intention is to evaluate the fair maturity of the repositories in our sample. This is a bit more details about basically the same thing, but we have three. I just want to communicate the three major tasks. So that the first one is the one to the left, where we are now working on. So we surveyed for repositories, and we have executed the maturity evaluation. And this is all part of the fair uptake task. Then we will we have barely started the implementation phase, where we will assist suitable repositories or communities with implementing either a certification of the repository or the implementation of data standards. So this is a closer collaboration with the communities. And those communities, by the way, may be, as Eric mentioned, may be communities that define various repositories from different domains, but that have similar fair implementation profiles. And then the last task focuses on policies, where we will map incentives that are in use and come up with possible new incentives that are not yet in broad use in the region, and also engage with stakeholders and policymakers. So that will mostly be in the last year. So this is a 3-year project, started September 2019. I'll go through relatively quickly this part about what is FAIR, because I'm assuming that most of you know what FAIR is, so it will be for repetition only, and Eric has already said a lot about that. But a recent report from the Digital Science report from last year I believe, has some interesting questions that pose to more than 8,500 respondents, I believe, which identifies some of the concerns that people have about sharing data. And although in general people are quite positive, or researchers are quite positive about sharing their data, there are some caveats, and one of them is licensing and copywriting. So that's one of the larger issues on this in this study. Also, the possible misuse of the data, and also not receiving appropriate credit or acknowledgement about the data. So those are things to think about when dealing with when considering to share your data. And I hope that some of the things that we do in this project can convince you or researchers that you work with to in fact share their data. So how familiar are these FAIR principles among the research communities that were responding to the survey? Not very much, less than I had imagined, certainly. In 2018, it was about 16%, and it grew to maybe 18 or 19% in 2019. And a surprising majority of the respondents have not heard about FAIR principles at all. Okay, so this is just a illustration of some of the important aspects of FAIR. So it's clear the definable aspects of having an identifier, a persistent identifier, rich metadata, indexing of data repositories, and to mention the PIDs in the metadata themselves. Accessibility, use of standard communication protocols, open free protocols, authentication, and metadata should always be available. Also, if the data itself disappears or is deleted. So that's for provenance reasons, persistence reasons. Interoperability, use of vocabularies, preferably vocabularies that are FAIR themselves, and use of a linked metadata. And the reusability aspect, to have multiple attributes in the metadata. Usage license is a major one, and the two last ones are more demanding and more extensive, I should say here, and this is regarding the provenance. So to keep track of what has happened and how these data came to be about, and how they have been processed until they are released. And also to implement and use established community standards. So this is, in a nutshell, what FAIR is about. And the overarching commonality here is that the metadata that describe these aspects and more should be machine actionable. So they should not only be understandable to humans. This is a very essential aspect of FAIR, of the FAIR principles, and something that we have taken to the extreme in some sense by evaluating solely on the machine actionability of the repositories that we have looked at. So this is from Go FAIR, what FAIR is not. So it's not a standard. It's not equal to open or free. There are examples of data that can be restricted and still perfectly fair. Fair does not mean that the data is equal to RDF or linked data or the semantic web. Fair is not assuming that only humans can find and reuse data. Also, machines should be able to do that. And and fair is not for humans only, but for machines as well. Yeah, the data that are not fair are in fact actually pretty useless. That is the bold statement of GoFair and also this project. And the concept that we are following is to have fair digital objects. And I'll get back to what that specifically means. But there are so you will never be 100% fair. There will always be something to struggle for, something to reach towards. But a totally unfair data set is one that doesn't have an identifier. The metadata is not identified explicitly, and the data itself is not even identified explicitly. So the first step is to actually provide a persistent identifier. At that point, at least humans can find the data set, and machines will find it, but they will not be able to do much about it. Then in this third panel, fair metadata. So by making your metadata, or at least part of the metadata, machine actionable, so using established explicit predicates or keys for describing the various aspects of the data or the metadata, and linking that to the PID, then you're taking an important step in making the data fair, or the metadata fair. And as I mentioned, it may well be that the data itself is restricted for copyright reasons or sensitivity or whatever, but having some metadata that actually describes what the digital object itself consists of is still important. And then you have in the fifth panel here the fact that you should also strive to explicitly identify in that fair digital object the metadata as a unit of itself, and the data element or elements. This should be identified with some standard keys that we will come back to later today. And then is to having all of this completely functionally linked, so that a machine will be able to trace all those elements that are explained with machine actionable metadata themselves, and act up and understand what the meaning of that is. So what is a fair digital object? So a globally unique identifier, or a persistent identifier as it's often referred to, is the first step, as I mentioned, and that resolves to a fair digital object identifier record that can visually be the equivalent of a landing page, and that record should point to the metadata, and ideally the metadata should also, preferably the metadata should also point back to the digital object itself. So this is all using metadata or keys, specific keys, describing with a fair digital object type what kind of record this is. So is it a collection? Is it a data set? Or and what typically doesn't happen is that the data itself is identified uniquely with a metadata key, that so that the machine can easily find and identify the data elements of that digital object. So if you're not familiar with this digital object concept, it basically is what you would normally think of as a data set. So a data set should ideally be described or defined as a fair digital object. So the FAIR principles are basically, so this what I've mentioned is sort of the underlying one possible implementation way to meet the FAIR principles. It will answer a great deal of the FAIR of the various principles. So I'm assuming that the principles themselves are relatively well known among you, but so I've borrowed these slides from Luis Bonino, which were used in the course. And in this slide here, the red principles that are highlighted in red color, those can be said to be related to metadata. Not necessarily only metadata, but certainly metadata is related to, as you can see, almost every single principle among the FAIR principles. And here the data resource, so the data elements that I was talking about in the digital object slide, they can be linked to the principles that are highlighted here in red. So not as extensive as the metadata. And now the more interesting part here is that so the red highlighted part of these principles in this slide can be addressed primarily by technology, which means that it really boils down to how you present your data, what software platform you use for your or what features you use for your data repository that can be linked to all of these red marked principles. And that's why evaluating more than 100 repositories, as we have done, is an important step in sort of mapping the state of fairness in the region. So what we have done then is so we acknowledge that the data are distributed in small and typically domain-specific data repositories, not in large data silos. And we want to help such repositories, such small or domain-specific repositories, to improve their potential for data reuse and becoming fairer. We also want to raise awareness of the FAIR practices and the importance of this machine actionable aspect of metadata and data itself for those data that's relevant. And we want to contribute to fair uptake across the region, and thereby the premise for better reuse of the data. So one method that is that some choose to use when they want to evaluate a repository is to do this according to some template or some schema and have evaluators, so persons that are doing this completely manually. So that is both time consuming. It may take 45 minutes to 1.5 or 2 hours per data set, and it's also prone to biases, and it's not very reproducible for the same reason. So in our project, we have chosen to do this entirely based on these machine actionable metadata, and in that way it can be automated fully or almost fully. And so what we're using then as criteria are metrics, these fair maturity indicators, and that is published in Wilkinson et al. In 2018, where there was a framework basically described with some metrics for measuring fairness of data. And then later, the second generation of tests, 22 tests, were developed again by Mark Wilkinson and others, and collaborators in the publications, and he created an evaluation tool. And this is the link to that tool, the public version of it, and this is the tool that we have used for our evaluations, although we have used a dedicated installation with freezing the version of both harvester and indicators, so that we can compare this over time. So this provides an efficient, scalable, and reproducible evaluation of fair maturity. So the maturity indicators, they measure aspects of the FAIR principles. So we just saw the principles, and the indicators can basically be linked to each of the principles. So here are the 22 current indicators, and in the third column highlighted in red are the principle that they are related to. And then in the final column, a short description of what is being tested. So these indicators are basically the ones that we have used for this study. Yeah, this is what the public evaluation service looks like. It's hosted at fairsharing.org. And this is what a typical evaluation will look like, with one of these green or red bars or indicators for each of the identifiers, whether they succeed or they fail. You also have a score here. So by clicking on each of these pluses, you will get more information about what specifically more specific information about why a test failed. So it's also relevant to point out that so this is the distribution of APIs being used among data repositories from re3 data. This is more than 2,000 repositories worldwide, and the majority of the repositories are using REST as their primary way to interact with users or machines. And this is the one that we have chosen to use. So we do not support explicitly the other APIs. Okay, so the methodology that we've used then is so we select basically any repository that has a link to the Nordic Baltic region, meaning that they contain data from that region. The sample is not exhaustive, so you may find that some repositories are not included, and that's simply because we have there is no ultimate source for obtaining information about repositories. In fact, the best source is re3data.org, which is why we recommend repositories to register there. It excludes repositories that only contain publications or articles. So we try to focus on data, on research data, and we also try to consider in the selection process that the data should have some relevance to research. And an important aspect, the repository must identify datasets by globally unique identifiers in order to be selected for evaluation. Otherwise, we cannot evaluate them using the evaluator, but they are still included in our sample. So the dataset selection is a manual process. So if a repository satisfies the previous criteria that I mentioned, then we go on to select datasets from that repository. And we do this by simply registering the global unique identifier. So that may be a URI or URL, or it may be, well, we have actually exclusively used the URI. But it may be a DOI or a handle or URN or some other identifier. We try to randomly select datasets from a given repository, scattering it across both time and scientific domains. We exclusively use these URIs, as I mentioned, as identifiers because there have been issues with the DOI, which is the second most used identifier in recent months, so that they don't properly resolve. I'll get back to this issue later also. And we take any data set to be representative of the repository in which it resides. So this is basically a premise which we have taken so that if we select 10 data sets from a repository and then we do make an average score among those 10 evaluations, then that becomes their representative score for that repository. Obviously, we could have, with more resources, could have expanded this to 100 or 1,000 data sets. But the range of repositories are quite large. Some repositories only have a small handful of data sets. Others have thousands of data sets. So then, does a single data set evaluation reliably indicate repository fair maturity level? So is that premise that I mentioned, is that really true? So we made a consistency test earlier in the project, or 4 or 5 months ago, where we evaluated 3 different repositories from within the sample. Each of them had, at that time, seemed to have either a low, medium, or high score. And then we selected 10. We evaluated 10 data sets from each of them. And the scores for each of these data sets are listed in these 10 columns in light blue here. And as you can see, the variation is very small in these 4, actually not 3, but 4 examples. Although there are some variations here in the 3rd row, and even larger and a rather large outlier in the 4th row. So I'll come back to this also, this topic. So that test basically indicated that taking an average score from 10 data sets could be a good indicator of the fairness of that repository. So now, obviously, we have done this for about 100 data sets, of which 28 could not be evaluated because they do not have a global unique identifier. So they are sort of indicated here by this red bar, but they are technically out of the sample, but they're not being evaluated as such, but we keep them in the sample because we have evaluated that they cannot be evaluated due to lack of a global unique identifier. So this is an average fair score, and over all of these, both the findability, accessibility, interoperability, and the reusability aspects. And the very large majority, about 2/3, fall in the low scoring category. That's not surprising, also in light of the meta study that I mentioned initially, indicated pretty much the same thing. But here we have a number which indicates then what is the score. And I should say that this large bar of 35 repositories, this is basically a score of 0, because the minimum score for providing a URI is 3 tests will pass, and that is the corresponding 0.13 score. So 72 repositories were evaluated. So that means in excess of 700 and some odd data sets were evaluated. And if we divide these scores into each of the F, A, I, and R segments, we see that for the findability aspect, there is no repository that does extremely well in terms of the existing indicators. So this is something to note, that findability can be significantly improved in many, for most or all repositories that we have looked at. The red bars here indicate that this is the minimum score. So that large bar is just because all the repositories that do not essentially have any machine actionable metadata that is recognized by the evaluator, they get 0.13 here. Similarly, for the A score, the A aspect, accessibility aspect, this has a minimum score of 0.4, in fact, and again, that explains the very large majority falling into this minimum category. But then there are some that does have a pretty good scores actually for accessibility, although there are on the order of 10 repositories. The I score is more scattered, although again the majority is completely 0. And is scattered almost throughout the entire spectrum, and one of the repositories actually score 100% on the interoperability aspect. And again, for the reusability aspect of the FAIR principles, the very large majority, more than 60 repositories, do not have any score in the reusability aspect. And I should note here that this is a very these measurements have a very large error bar, because there's only basically one element which is tested, and that is whether data sets are equipped with a standard license predicate or key. And as you can see, only about 10 repositories or less have are equipped with that, and many of those that do, they don't have this for all their data sets. So it's only some of the data sets that have that score on this reusability aspect or the license aspect. But for repositories, they score 100% on the average, which means that the 10 data sets that we explored were successful on that aspect. I will go about 5 or 6 minutes over time, but hope you'll bear with me. I'm eating into your lunchtime. So now, these were all results based on averages over 10, typically 10 data sets for each of the repositories. This is what the long list of 700 or so evaluations looks like. So we have a repository ID, then we have a string which describes which test succeeded and which didn't, and then we convert that into a score. And as you can see, the large majority of these, they score 0 on R. So that is one aspect which can relatively easily be improved by addressing this issue in the future. And in the final column there's and the number of tests passed indicated out of the 22 total. There was a question which we may take at this point. I don't have the view of who it was, but there was a raised hand. Pauli, are you?
Yeah, I just had to unmute myself. So there is Ginte. Ginte, you can ask you now your question. Do you hear me, Ginte?
Okay, we'll just continue. So each of these data sets or digital objects were then has basically an evaluation summary, and that looks like this. So for one data set here, the score was 4 passes for the out of 8 F metric tests, 4 out of 5 A metric tests, and all 7 interoperability metrics passed, and all of the R metrics passed. So this is, I believe, the strongest scoring data set in the sample. As you can see here, on all the green on the red on the right side of the page here indicates that the 7 I metrics did pass. And if you click on one of these tests, then you can see what led that to pass for that specific indicator. And what the evaluator is basically doing is going to following the URL to the or the DOI or whatever PID that was given, and then it harvests all the content of that page and all the references, external references from that page, and looks for these metadata that is relevant for each of the indicators, and then judges whether it's a pass or not. So that's the essence of the evaluation. So we had, in fact, 714 data sets. It's not exactly 720 because some data sets did not have, some repositories did not have even 10 data sets in their sample at the time that we selected them. And this amounted to about 4 days, a little over 4 days of execution time for evaluating these 714 data sets. So thanks to parallelization, this only took half a day, but in the total execution time of this is quite significant. So I should note also that for this run that I'm presenting the results for now, the indicator for metadata identifier explicitly in metadata, which is one of the tests, that only accepts an exact match. That means if there is in fact a metadata identifier for the metadata, but that is not the URI, but for instance the DOI, if it has one, then this will fail. This test fails as it is now. So we are working with Mark Wilkinson to improve that in the near future. And the other thing I should mention is that all tests, all the indicators the indicator test for searchable, whether a data set is searchable from a major search engine, that was disabled for this run because we have a license issue with Bing. So Bing is currently the only search engine that searches open link data, and that's why it's currently the evaluator is currently only exploring Bing. So those are the two indicators that I mentioned that were basically not working for this evaluation. Well, number 7 was working, but only in a very strict sense. Okay, I think I'll skip this one in the interest of time. So then, looking at the total results, how does this fare? So this is basically all the results for the 72 repositories that were tested, and the scores are provided for the F, A, I, and R, and then there's a weighted average in the column for the fare, and then there are the respective standard deviations for each of those. So a non-green box on these 5 last columns indicates that that score has varied rather significantly, and so that suggests that the results are not they vary from data set to data set. So it would be ideal to test maybe 100 or even more data sets for those. Another thing to note here is what I already mentioned about the R score. Only very few of the repositories actually score 100% or even anything on this test, due to the fact that there's essentially just a single test on whether the license keyword is present. But otherwise, not surprisingly, I should add, is that there's a lot of red here, meaning that there's a great potential for improvement for almost all repositories. And I'd like to specifically mention here that, taking one repository which has 12.5% in F and 40% in A, this is what I already mentioned. That is the minimum score. So any URL will score that amount of on these tests. So the ones highlighted here in green are the 3 top ranked repositories. I'm not identifying which repository this is, but I'm just noting that one aspect to maybe take home is that all 3 of them are running on an established software platform. So 2 of them are using Figshare as their provider for the service, and as a 3rd one is using CCAN, which I believe is an open source platform. So again, it seems to be that by choosing an established software platform for releasing your data on, that is a good step in making your data fair. Although I should add, there are variations between this. So just using Figshare is not enough. There are choices to be made on whether to provide licenses or not, for instance. So that clearly affects the score. And if you look at the re3 data sample of more than 2,000 repositories worldwide, the very large majority use unknown software platforms. And you can add the others here also. So basically, those are all probably the large fraction of those are self or own developed projects, and these relatively or the more known platforms such as Dataverse, DSpace, CCAN, and Figshare for that matter is is not very well represented. So this is a list of some of the platforms that are available to be considered. This is from Digital Curation Center, so it can be found on their webpage. Yes, so now to the conclusion. I'll maybe skip quickly the highlights because I think you will have remembered those. But basically, the recommendations here is for now. And I should add that these evaluations that we have done are probably pretty much the final ones, but they're the two indicators that I mentioned that were not done to our satisfaction, that has to be redone. But otherwise, the results are pretty much finished for this early evaluation. So the first and foremost recommendation is for repositories to issue data sets with a global unique identifier, and clearly also preferably a persistent identifier. Also, we recommend repositories to register in retrievedata.org because that will increase the discoverability of the repository, and it will be easier to do studies or meta studies in the future for others, and it will simply be more complete. We also recommend to employ the concept of a fair digital object when publishing data sets. And one example of that, which is being tested by the evaluator, is whether there is a metadata identifier explicitly in the metadata, and correspondingly also an identifier for the data itself. This was an unfinished sentence here, sorry for that. But this should be you make use of linked metadata from established vocabularies. So as far as possible, use standard vocabularies that have been that are, for instance, found on fairsharing.org. And the final one is to, which I believe should be a fairly low-hanging fruit, is to state the license agreements using for the given data set using one of the 5 listed predicates or keys for license. This is noted in the supplement documents that is posted on that we distributed. Yes, so with that, thank you, and